What's up, you guys? Sean Ross Sapp, managing editor of Fightful.com, here for Fightful.com's UFC 219 post show. I want to thank you guys for checking out our UFC 219 preview show. A little different, a little unconventional, as Showdown Joe was, or still is, in Japan. As we speak right now, he is calling Ryzen with former Fightful podcaster Frank Trigg, friend of the site. He has had exclusives up with Mirko Cro Cop talking about his potential retirement, as well as his Ryzen blog on Fightful.com. Make sure you guys go and check that out. Lots of cool stuff over there. But if you watched that preview show, you saw a ton of interviews integrated from the guy that's joining me right now, James Lynch. James, what's up, my man?
How's it going, Sean? Thanks for having me on. Happy to fill in for Joe while he's kicking ass in Japan with Ryzen.
Yeah, man, that's a tough schedule for him. We found out the flight information and all that stuff, and of course he was going to be out for this big show, and of course it made sense to have you here. And you've had a bunch of big interviews on Fightful.com just over the past week or so. I mean, just Stephen Wonderboy Thompson, Stipe Miocic, Colby Covington, bringing the goods to Fightful.com.
Wouldn't have it any other way. Got to bring the goods. We got to close out this year strong, Sean. We can't just, people like to make their New Year's resolutions in 2018. You got to finish strong with 2017.
You're damn right you do. And we're in a situation right now. This is a little bit different. No Saturday night UFC for like 4 weeks.
Yeah.
Until UFC 220.
Yeah,
it's unbelievable. Usually they got a.
I was going to say you have that UFC Fight Night 124 card on the 13th, so I think we only missed one weekend, right?
Well, yeah. Well, no, there's the 7th, the 14th. Okay, yeah. So only one weekend out, but yeah, no. Okay, it's 3 weeks, not 4 weeks. Gosh, my head's a little off. For some reason, I thought that New Year's was next weekend. That shows you. The grind, the schedule. But anyway, we got UFC 219 to talk about. What stood out to you the most on this card? This isn't one that they're going to be using in a lot of highlight reels.
I think there's only one thing that really stood out to me, and that was the performance by Khabib Nurmagomedov. There was a lot of questions heading into this fight with his weight cut, him missing weight against Tony Ferguson and that fight getting scratched. I mean, he had a lot of pressure going into this, even before, he stepped into the cage. Was he going to make this weight? And of course he did. And then even then when he was fighting Barboza, I saw a lot of people split on this, people saying that he couldn't, stand and trade with Barboza. And that was a mauling. I've not seen a dominant performance like that in a very long time from one fighter, especially a fighter in Khabib who's only fought, I think 3 or 4 times since 2014. It's been a very long time since we've seen him in the cage as well, even since his last fight. And he went out there and he mauled Barboza. I've never seen Barboza dominated that badly. And we're talking about one of the best strikers in the 155-pound division. And it was just an incredible performance. And I think that really stole the show tonight. Cris Cyborg defending her title was absolutely great. But I think when we look back on this card, it's going to be the performance by Khabib Nurmagomedov.
So let's get into the show from the top. We'll move on down. Cris Cyborg successfully defends her UFC featherweight championship over Holly Holm, former UFC bantamweight champion. Early on, there was some hope for Holly Holm. I really didn't expect to see her muscle around Cris Cyborg in the clinch, but she did with regularity. But as the fight went on, Cris Cyborg figured out Holm's striking patterns, James.
Yeah, she sure did. And it also seemed to throw Holly off a little bit. If you heard on the commentary, Dominic Cruz was talking about how Holly had, successfully in those early rounds was able to get those underhooks in and sort of neutralize Cyborg and in her stand-up and sort of control her a little bit. And you notice that sort of went out the window in the later rounds because what was happening, at least from what I was seeing, was Cyborg was just landing shots and really sort of hurting Holly as the fight was going on. Her shots were a lot harder. And you saw Holly, still being as active as she could, but just those counters were really hurting her in the fight. And you saw it at the end of the fight with Holly's face, completely battered. Cyborg did a great job, and obviously the game plan worked. And, forget any arguments that people had about her cardio. Cyborg, looked pretty good for all 5 rounds.
Yeah, that was a big question heading into this. And the funny thing is, I thought that Khabib Nurmagomedov had the most questions to answer on this show. And really, it didn't answer that many. It just reinforced what we already knew. Cris Cyborg, there was a big one as it pertains to her cardio because she had never been that far.
Right.
Meanwhile, Holly Holm, like 3 or 4 different times in her MMA career alone, she had been to the 5th round. She had been the distance, or at least in that 5th round. Not to mention all the times in her boxing career, she went like into late rounds. So, man, that's something that you can't count on Cris Cyborg you can't count on her to burn out towards the end of the fight. That's just not something. And Marloes Coenen is the only person we saw take her this far. Now, in my estimation, without a doubt, this is the highest caliber opponent Cris Cyborg has ever faced. And before that, it was Marloes Coenen. After that, it's a real steep drop. So there were a lot of questions about Cris Cyborg in that regard too. Like, would she live up to the hype? Because, forever there was talk of the Rousey fight, and the UFC almost had it happen in 2013. Cyborg, didn't like the financial deals, didn't like the weight, whatever it was, and moved on to Invicta. But she sought out that big fight, and maybe the UFC missed out on some of her pay-per-view drawing power at that point. But I saw that you retweeted something like, there's nothing to indicate that Cyborg is a giant draw right now. There's not. But she is a perfectly serviceable main eventer in the UFC, and beating a person like Holly Holm doesn't hurt.
It certainly doesn't, and it'll just sort of add to that. But again, I don't think she has sort of that household name that people would like to have. And I think sometimes, we as fans, we don't live outside the bubble, and you have to look at, what are draws, and it's usually the people who get sort of outside that hardcore MMA bubble. And a lot of people don't know Cyborg. This will certainly help. I mean, this was a big fight tonight. I was genuinely very excited for this one, and I think again, this is probably the closest fight we're going to see with with Cris Cyborg. Potentially for a long time. I mean, nothing against, Megan Anderson or whoever else might end up fighting her next, but I think this is as close as it might get. I mean, I'd love to be proven wrong, but at this point, I don't see that happening. But no, this certainly helped Cyborg's name. But again, I don't know what type of contenders they're going to throw at Cris Cyborg going forward. Because just if you look even outside of, Megan Anderson, as far as, featherweight prospects, there just isn't a lot on the shelf. And I don't really know what they're going to do from that perspective.
There's really none, and that's sad. But Holm didn't switch it up a lot for all of the touting, the Jackson Winklejohn game planning, which hasn't necessarily been something that's been touted exceedingly over the last few years. Early on, hers was good, but she never adapted. She never changed. But Cris Cyborg did adapt and did change. Figured out that Holly Holm was circling to the power hand an awful lot. And man, every time that Holly Holm would take her 2 steps, pop in, throw her straight, she would get countered, and she'd get countered hard. And that happened, it seemed like dozens of times, because Cyborg, it seemed like, was almost on autopilot. Just, okay, I'm waiting for this. Bam, here's the right.
Yeah, and she seemed a lot, and they talked about this on the broadcast, she was a lot more stationary as the fight went on, but it was working for her. I mean, Holly was literally running into shots at certain points. Cyborg wasn't doing a ton of movement, but she was landing, and that was slowing Holm down as the fight sort of progressed, and you could see it with the damage on her face. I mean, she got hit a number of times. Now, one interesting thing about this too that, kind of is probably going to get overlooked is, Cyborg got hit a lot as well too, but the fact that she's such a gamer and, Holm just doesn't have the type of power that Cyborg does. She was able to sort of, weather that, and it didn't even really seem to face her. I mean, there were some shots that Holm landed that I think could have dropped a lot of other fighters, but Cyborg, to her credit, just very durable.
The Holly Holm situation is much like the Lyoto Machida situation to me. She's got this masterful footwork that works so well against other people. The head movement isn't necessarily there, which is weird for a boxer, but she had other tools to rely on. She leaves her head just pretty much stationary. But when she gets aggressive, much like a Machida, she finds a lot of success. It's just a matter of getting her to switch into that gear and getting her out of her comfort zone. Because I've said this a million times on the show, James. For years, if you go back and watch her legacy fights, you could tell she was pretending whoever she was in the cage with was Ronda Rousey. Her fights, all of those fights leading up to Ronda Rousey, were practice for Ronda Rousey. If she got in the clinch with an absolute scrub, she would get out of the clinch because that's what she would have done with Ronda Rousey. And right after that, we saw her run into a Miesha Tate, and she had some problems. Miesha Tate, who doesn't necessarily have the highest skill set, and Holly Holm met a lot of success there. We saw the glimmers of success against Cyborg. We saw them in a lot of people thought that she beat Germaine de Randamie as well. It's just, man, it's a tough division. For one, it's a celebrity division is what it is. That's really what it is. But where do you see Holly Holm going from here? Does she go back to 130? I mean, she has to go back to 135, right? There's nothing at 145.
Yeah, I don't really know what options there are at 45 at this point, and I mean, it just doesn't seem like the UFC is too interested in any other fights for featherweight that are outside the title picture. So Holly will go down to 35. I guess there's a few interesting matchups for her down there. It's interesting. I was thinking about this tonight. Nunes and her still haven't fought yet, which is kind of interesting, just the way sort of the titles have changed hands and everything. But yeah, they'll find someone for her down there, and maybe she'll get another highlight reel win. I mean, we forget that. Holly lost a couple fights. Granted, you mentioned the Duran one was a close one. I thought she won as well, but she had lost 2 in a row, and then she fought Bethe Correia. And really, if you think of Bethe Correia, not a great fighter, but she got that highlight reel win, and all of a sudden that was enough to propel her into this fight. So I think it's a similar case here where Holly could go back down to 35, fight whoever, get in another impressive highlight reel win, and then she could be back in the driver's seat because she does have that win over Ronda Rousey, and that will forever boost her ahead of a lot of other fighters, and just because of the name value and everything else, and being from Jackson's. But you wonder, though, I was looking on the broadcast at her age. I mean, she's getting up there. Realistically, how much longer is she going to fight? And that's something to behold. But yeah, I think her next fight will be at 35, but probably against someone not really too notable, in my opinion.
And that's something we don't really know yet about women MMA fighters at this high level, is at what age does the decline start? Showdown Joe had a great feature up on Fightful.com recently. Thanks to Casey Walton for doing the legwork on the numbers. But you see the average age of ranked UFC fighters. And when you go from flyweight to heavyweight, it gets older as you go up with one distortion, and that's middleweight. Middleweight is the only like step aside from that. As far as women, you can't really put anything into that women's strawweight ranking right now because, come on, those are all kinds of weird. And really, the UFC rankings are kind of tough anyway. I'd like to see those done with like maybe a fightmatrix.com or something like that, a little more metric. But that is something to wonder. Holly Holm, no spring chicken, but neither is Marion Renault, and she does okay. Also, you mentioned Holly Holm going back to 135. She has a win over Raquel Pennington. It looks better and better. You spoke to Raquel Pennington earlier this month. What was her timetable looking like? Because I know that she was a little further ahead of schedule than many thought because the injury didn't end up being as bad as once feared.
I believe she said May was when she was planning on returning, and of course it was a hunting accident or something along those lines. So she's, I know she was in the process of healing up. Like she wasn't on crutches or anything when I saw her at UFC 218 because she was there cornering Tisha Torres. So she's definitely up there. I think really the question is what is going to happen with Amanda Nunes, because if Amanda Nunes fights Cris Cyborg, that ties up the title, and then maybe you could have a Raquel Holly rematch, something along those lines, or if Nunes is going to stay, then I think Raquel has done more than enough to deserve herself a title shot. So I think that's really good. Well, it'll be interesting to see what they do there. But I think at this point, if, pending any issues, I think Megan Anderson should be next for Cyborg. You might as well just get that one out of the way and get it done, especially with the fact that I think it's 221 in Perth. It needs a co-main event. I think that would be a perfect fight.
If I'm the UFC, I probably do Holm versus Caitlin Vieira because you got to give Holly Holmes won one of her last like 4 or 5 fights, and that's tough. But if Amanda Nunes wanted to fight Cyborg, that's probably the best option they have. It's a better option than Megan Anderson from a financial standpoint, and they've proven that that's a concern. Shevchenko might be moving to 125, so you can't. And I don't know that a lot of people are clamoring for a Nunes Shevchenko rematch. But if Pennington gets back in there as soon as she'd like, that is a little tough to do the Nunes Cyborg fight, but I mean that if it makes money, that's what they're concerned about. So a lot of things to look out for as it pertains to the women's landscape.
It certainly is. And I should mention Shevchenko does have a fight booked at flyweight. So I think she's going to be staying in that division. I think, with the rematch not going her way against Nunes, I think she's sort of out of the equation at this point. But you're right. There's a lot of other fights, I'm sure, for Holly Holm, that could be out there at this point. But I'm with you. I think they'll probably do maybe a prospect against, Holm, because at this point, Holm's been used in every possible title scenario other than fighting Amanda Nunes. So at this point, it is sort of the point of where you got to, get a prospect in there with her and see, kind of one of those rite of passages fights.
Oh, she's been their utility woman. A lot of people don't realize that. Like she's been used on the undercards of shows. She's been used in a main event against Ronda Rousey. She's been used on Fox. She's been used on big shows like UFC 196 was such a fun show to watch and a big show for them. She's been used in the inaugural title fight of a new division. She's been used over in the main event of a Singapore show, and she's been used to bring in to fight Cris Cyborg. She's really fit into any role that they've asked her to. And now she's in a situation where she is 500 in the UFC. She's 4-4.
Yeah, it's weird to think,
Crazy.
isn't it?
Yeah, but I mean, she's never been just blown out of the water is the thing. Like, she hangs in there.
Well, especially that Miesha Tate fight. I was there live cage side. You know, it's just crazy how the sport is. You know, Holly Holm holds on for another round, and she wins the title, and then she's probably fighting Nunes after. I mean, things could have been completely different for her. And she's just had this weird sort of career where she loses to Tate, and then she fights Shevchenko, loses that fight when people thought she was probably going to win. And then she fights Durandamine, where they're like, okay, we'll definitely get her as the champion at 45. Arguably wins that fight, loses a controversial decision. I mean, she's had, I don't know anyone who's had such a weird career like she's had, having the big win over Rousey and then having all these weird losses in between. It's very bizarre.
It really is. So going into the show, like, I picked Holly Holm in an upset because there were too many questions about Cris Cyborg in my estimation. Similar to Khabib Nurmagomedov, I thought that if Michael Johnson was able to connect with Khabib, that Edson Barboza would be able to. But as I think everybody knew, if that clinch range was accomplished, that's it. And that clinch range was accomplished. Khabib Nurmagomedov didn't necessarily answer a lot of the questions about his ability to take a punch. And there were some weird things like most fighters don't have the luxury of crossing their feet walking forward against somebody, because if you get struck, you're off balance, and it sets up an easy takedown. Khabib Nurmagomedov is not worried about being taken down. And what we watched, like, not only will Edson Barboza need to go through therapy, I think I need to go through therapy after seeing that. That's a little disturbing. That was a 30-24 scorecard there, and it was justifiable.
It was a mauling. It really was. I picked Khabib to win this fight. I just felt like he'd be able to get on the inside and sort of control him like he's done with all of his other opponents. I know Barboza, has sort of a good height and reach for that division where, maybe he could have stayed on the outside, picked his shots. But against Khabib, it's really tough to do that. And I did not expect him to dominate Barboza the way he did, though. I figured, he'd probably just take him down, eat a few shots, this and that. But he absolutely mauled him. That was a fight where I think Barboza's corner should have thrown it in maybe after the second. He took a lot of damage. There's no sense. I don't know, just from my perspective, I didn't think there was any way that Barboza was going to land sort of a Hail Mary knockout punch at any point. Khabib was doing a great job of sort of cutting inside the distance. But like I said, what's even more impressive is, Khabib, has fought, I think, 4 times since 2014. Barboza's fought 9 times since then. So if you think about that, like, the amount of activity that he's had, being in there, it just shows that, certain fighters can, they're still putting the time in the gym, and it doesn't really matter if they're out of there. But yeah, that was a dominant mauling performance. And I think, if there was like a 2% chance that Conor McGregor was going to fight Khabib Nurmagomedov, that has now gone down to 0%. I don't see any way that Conor fights Khabib after a performance like that tonight.
The irony is, I think that Conor McGregor stands probably the best chance of anybody at beating him because he does have that ungodly knockout power. And even then, it's like, damn, man, after the way we saw Nate Diaz handle Conor McGregor on the ground, like, just that we've seen that weakness in Conor McGregor makes me think that's just too much of a weakness. Now, the real issue is Khabib making weight. And he did, and he's got Tyler Minton, and you, of course, had an exclusive with Tyler, because why the hell wouldn't you?
Yeah, exactly.
And, like, 2 weeks after, I hear everybody on podcasts and radio shows, oh, did you hear? He's got a new nutritionist. And I'm like,
yeah, we were like 2 weeks ahead on that,
Yeah, so, come on. James had that weeks ago. When I see Tony Ferguson up ahead, I'm like, no, you don't stand a chance. And I am a Tony Ferguson believer. The man is a joy to watch. But, man, a guy that had a competitive fight with Lando Venata, and no disrespect to Lando Venata, but got taken down by Kevin Lee, staph infection Kevin Lee, not even like good Kevin Lee. Like, we're knocking on death's door. Like, if he flies home, he might not be okay, Kevin Lee. Like, because if Khabib Nurmagomedov is on top of Tony Ferguson in that situation, Tony Ferguson's not getting up.
Possible. I actually think that fight's going to be a little bit closer. And the reason I think that is just I think styles make fights. And I think Ferguson is a very unorthodox guy. I think he's definitely the most unorthodox fighter that Khabib would be fighting. And you look at the fact that Ferguson had a bit of a layoff heading into the Lee fight. I mean, we forget that he fought Dos Anjos in November of 2016. He fought Lee almost, close to a year later in October of 2017 this year. It's interesting. But again, the way Khabib was able to just get in there, take him down and go at will, it's interesting to see what happens. The thing with Ferguson is, Lee arguably won that first round against Ferguson, but he was able to come back and, Lee sort of ran out of gas. But the question is, let's say Khabib took Ferguson down in the first round, could he adjust and, sort of change his game plan a little bit? It'll be interesting. But I mean, if I had to pick right now, of course I'm going Khabib, but I think Ferguson definitely is a different style matchup for Khabib. So that could pose things a little bit differently. So I'm excited for that fight, to be honest. It's going to be great.
The thing that worries me for Tony Ferguson is how he likes to roll out of situations like onto his back, and that's not a good idea against a Khabib Nurmagomedov, which I'm sure he would adjust. I love that Khabib grabs the wrist of the opponent that they're using to balance, and then he controls their balance after that and throws those strikes. It's just masterful wrestling. It's great stuff, and that UFC lightweight division is just a ball. It is a ball. But I really do, and I'm not saying that I would favor Conor McGregor, but I do think that Conor McGregor stands the best chance at beating Khabib Nurmagomedov, and that's not a good chance. Now, Khabib is saying that he wants to go to 145. I assume that he also wants to try stand-up comedy as well, because that seemed to be the way he was going. But there you go. Carla Esparza defeated. Oh, also worth noting, Khabib has been in the title picture since 2014. Has never had a 5-round fight. Even
it's crazy.
Never fought a 5-round fight. Like, not just, he's had them scheduled, but he's never made it to them. Number 9, Carla Esparza defeated number 6, Cynthia Calvillo, who you interviewed recently. And Esparza is a former strawweight champion, or former, strawweight champion, who has a win over Rose Namajunas. And for a little while, it looked like I didn't know if Esparza was going to fight again. Like, I thought maybe that Joanna fight just made her be like, all right, I'm out. This was Carla Esparza adapting and overcoming, because she got put on her back pretty early.
Yeah, she did. And Calvillo came out, quite strong, but I just think she wasn't able to sort of, it seemed like when it was on the feet that Esparza definitely had the advantage there. The one thing I really noted was the leg kicks. Calvillo just wasn't checking those. And so, the striking sort of favored Esparza as the fight went on. And I think too, if you notice, Calvillo tried to take Esparza down in that third. She wasn't able to do it. So, maybe getting a little depleted there. But it's been, Esparza quietly has amassed this 3-1 record. Really should be 4-0, and as a Canadian, I can admit this. I thought she beat Randa Marcos in earlier this year in February on that Halifax card. So really, if you think about it, since she's lost to Joanna, she pretty much should be undefeated at this point. And with the fact she holds the win over Rose, will that mean she fights her next? I don't know. I think the UFC is still going to do Joanna and Rose the rematch as far as what's next there. But this definitely helps, because Calvillo had a lot of momentum. The UFC was clearly high on her. I mean, she fought 4 times this year, which is pretty crazy to think. That she's had that many fights in the UFC, and it's going to be very interesting. But Calvillo, pretty busy year for her. She actually fought 5 times this year. People forget she fought Montana De La Rosa in LFA in January, and then she got signed to the UFC and then fought the 4 times. So no shame in having a record like that this year, a 4-1 record. So, lots to expect from her in 2018. But Esparza, she's now a contender in that division again, and, it'll be interesting to see what they do with her next.
Yeah, because she has it. I mean, she's beaten Rose before, and Rose has improved just drastically since then. But still, she does have that victory. Calvillo was not happy with the decision. What did you think? Did you think it was the right call?
Yeah, I absolutely do. I gave the first round to Calvillo, and I gave the last 2 to Esparza. Again, what you have to look at in this fight was just the activity. I feel like Esparza did a lot more on the feet, and Calvillo just wasn't, checking those kicks. She wasn't sort of able to implement her game plan in those later rounds, and it really showed. And I don't think there was any debate from a lot of people. I understand her frustration because, she was bringing the fight. But again, if you look at the strikes, bit by bit, Esparza was landing more, and I think that really sort of counts for something. And yeah, I mean, what can I say? I think Calvillo maybe underestimated Esparza a little bit in this fight.
One thing I noticed was John Anik and the UFC announced team kind of downplaying Calvillo's inexperience. To me, I would probably play it up. The fact that she was she turned pro after this site came into existence. Like, for the love of God, she's been a pro since late August last year. Now, she did have a pro fight scheduled in 2014. But I mean, if she was so hurt that she couldn't compete for 2 years, 2.5 years, like I'm just letting that one ride. And that is kind of impressive. But she's actually older than Carla Esparza, which is weird to think. What do you think happens to Cynthia Calvillo? I'd say Esparza gets a pretty high-level fight, but I mean, Tecia Torres is matched up already. Maybe where do you see each one of these women perhaps going?
Well, Esparza is definitely going to get a big fight next. I don't think it'll be Rose, like I said. I think they're probably going to do that rematch. Even though, I wouldn't mind seeing some fresh blood in there. We've seen Joanna so many times in title fights. It'd be nice to.
They scheduled Torres already, and I thought if anybody got a title shot, it would have been Torres.
Well, Torres got a decision. I mean, that's the thing. If Torres had gone out there and finished, it was Waterson she fought. I think that would be a different story. But I think, you kind of look at, the fact that she's had a lot of decisions in a couple of her fights. I think that's not as convincing as some other people. The matchup that sort of stands out to me right now, and she came off a pretty brutal loss. I know sometimes you don't like matching up fighters with wins and losses, but Claudia Gadelha, that's a fresh matchup for Carla at this point. Claudia is back. I don't know if you saw on Twitter, she went on a bit of a hiatus there. And if you remember, they were supposed to fight at Invicta FC4 way back in 2013. So, it'd be interesting to have that matchup actually take place. And as far as Calvillo, I'm just looking at the rankings here. I mean, maybe someone like Michelle Waterson would be interesting. A bit of a name. How
is Michelle Waterson ranked ahead of Felice Herrig at this point?
I don't who's voting on these things. That's a podcast in itself. But someone like I think someone that's going to be an interesting like Waterson brings it and is a bit of a notable name. How about Courtney Casey? I know Casey lost a fight to Herrig, but again always brings it, always entertaining. I think Calvillo is still going to get a good push from the UFC. And you mentioned her age; they got to give her big fights and just really ride this out and speed this up as fast as they can because being at 30, I mean she's probably in her prime right now. You got to take advantage of it, and she's definitely become sort of a fan favorite just with her fight style and also being a member of Team Alpha Male.
Well, those strawweight rankings right now mean absolutely crap because who knows where Gadelha is going to fight next. She says 115. Yeah. Andrade is probably moving to 125, I would imagine. Calderwood is. Paige Van Zant's already scheduled. So you're getting like a third of that division moving up because I'll tell you this, Lauren Murphy ain't going to be ranked number 2 at flyweight for very long. That's not going to stick around. But there's a lot of interesting fights. Esparza, she's going to look up, or at least in the top 10. She ain't fighting Herrig. That's her buddy. So maybe Kowalkiewicz or something like that would be a good one.
Yeah.
Neil Magny defeated Carlos Condit. Seemed like, well, I don't know if you submitted your staff picks, but we were the only 2 that had Magny. To me, the burden of proof was on Carlos Condit at this point. Not Neil Magny.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I have staff picks for another site. I would love to put them in on Fightful. We got to do that up.
Starting. What are you doing, buddy?
Yeah, we got to get this up for 2018. But I did pick Magny, and part of it was just the fact that Magny, he'd been a lot more active, and I know he was coming off the loss to Rafael Dos Anjos, but Magny's one of those guys that can surprise in fights, and I thought this was a good situation. Condit having the layoff, potentially thinking about retirement. He has his business now. There's a lot on his plate, and I just felt like we wouldn't see the Carlos Condit of old, and it turns out I was right. Not to downplay anything Magny did. I see a lot of people talking about how this was, Condit, not the same Condit, not the same Condit that goes to Carlos Condit. I get all that. Trust me. I mean, there's certainly a decline, from the Carlos Condit that we saw fight Robbie Lawler. But we got to give credit to Neil Magny in this. He did a good job of neutralizing his attack. He had a good game plan. It seemed like he really went in there and just was, stopping Condit from his onslaught. He was the more aggressive fighter in this matchup. It wasn't a pretty fight, but hey, Magny got the job done, and he's done quite well in the UFC. I was just pointing this out today. He's never lost back-to-back fights in the UFC since he started 1 and 2 when he started his UFC career. So he's been on quite the run, and he's fought really tough guys. And I thought this was just a great performance for him, in the welterweight division.
Yeah, that welterweight title. It's like it's the curse of GSP, man. Like Robbie Lawler's still hanging in there, but Carlos Condit isn't what he once was. Johnny Hendricks isn't what he once was. Tyron Woodley's doing fine though, but Carlos Condit and Neil Magny, I thought that Carlos Condit had to overcome that reach, and that was going to be tough with the way that he fights because he likes to pop in and out. And Neil Magny has like a freakish reach. Also, I just didn't see how Carlos Condit could overcome the clinch either of Neil Magny, which is really good. And Neil Magny is among, and this isn't to say it disrespectfully, among the best gatekeepers in MMA history. Yeah. History. Because he's a guy that has wins over Condit, Hendricks, Lombard, like Gastelum. He's going to let you know if you don't belong in that division or if you need to move around or something like that. And he's been beaten by guys like Dos Anjos, Larkin, Maia. Like, so his losses are pretty forgivable. So Neil Magny's still getting it done, and he had that just amazing 2015 year and 2014 year where he just, it seemed like every weekend he was fighting. He fought like 9 or 10 times during that period. So I was happy to see Neil Magny pick up a win and get back in the win column because Carlos Condit at this point, like I said, the burden of proof was on him. I needed to see where his skills were at, and everybody assuming that those skills were still where they once were. I was like, but what has indicated that? Like we saw him get beaten very, very quickly by Damian Maia last year. And other than that, it's been 2 years since we've seen him fight, like outside of that fight. He's won twice since the Nick Diaz fight. Like there's nothing to indicate to me that he would have defeated a guy at this point at the level of Neil Magny. You think he keeps fighting? Because I mean, after this performance, I don't see why he wouldn't. It's not like he can't hang with a 10 to 15 or maybe below guy.
Yeah, I think he'll get maybe one more in, probably like a notable fight, like some sort of like notable veteran in there. You know, I don't know who sort of comes to mind at this point, but you know, just give him one more sort of send off because I don't think anybody really wants him to you know, ride up into the sunset like this, losing to Neil Magny the way he did. So I think he'll maybe fight 1 or 2 more times. But you know, he's got that business. MMA Fighting did a great video, you know, talking about his coffee business and everything. So I mean, it's interesting to see that he has stuff outside of fighting at this point. But you know, I just, you know, it's the natural born killer, you know, former WC champ. Do you want to see him, you know, with that unanimous decision loss to Magny is riding off into the sunset? I would like to see one more fight where, you know, he can kind of show what he's made of and, you know, maybe not have such a long layoff.
Well, I don't think he's going to retire anyway. I think Bellator would throw a bunch of money at him for that 170 division anyway. Or, you know, he could not cut weight and fight at 185 for all we know. I mean, he probably ain't beating Carvalho at this point, but elsewhere on this show, Dan Hooker defeated Mark Diakiese, and Diakiese's thing is he's such a quick, fast striker, but he wasn't able to get there, and he went for a real lazy shot in the 3rd round and got guillotined. Dan Hooker won. Perhaps the most entertaining thing is after a less than exhilarating fight, he gets on the mic and he says, "I want to fight in Perth. Who wants to see me back in the cage?" And everybody boos him.
Yeah, it was shades of Paul Buentello post-fight after one of his matchups. Just, you know, didn't go over.
Fear the consequences.
Yeah, exactly. It was, yeah, I did not. This was a really awful fight. I mean, thank God that they, you know, that this ended in a finish because it was putting a lot of people to sleep. And this was supposed to be one of the fights of the night. I mean, I actually, you know, I interviewed Diakiese. I also interviewed Hooker as well. And, you know, just they were both excited, and it seemed like this was the perfect scenario. And then, you know, Hooker gets the win as the underdog. It was pretty interesting. And then, yeah, and that's that. Man, Mark Diakiese, what a disappointment this has been in 2017. Here was a guy, what was he, 11-0, 12-0. And, you know, when he came into the UFC, he got that nice win. And then he loses to Drakkar Klose, and now he loses to Dan Hooker. Like, you know, 24 years old. I know there's a lot of potential there, but this is very disappointing for him, a guy that I know they were really high on when they signed him.
Yeah, if I'm him, I try to move over to the Performance Center, the Performance Institute, see what I can get going there.
Yeah.
Elsewhere on this show, Myles Jury looked real good. He looked real good. And the thing is, he's been around for a while. Like I remember in 2015 or 2012 when he came into the UFC, I was like, wow, his game is right on point for this point in time. And since then, the game has evolved quite a bit. And I won't say that his game has necessarily evolved, but he's taken his style and applied it to today, and he just looked really good in doing it. And he had a big layoff. Like from December 2015 to April of this year, he's come back, and he has just looked very good.
Yeah, we forget, how good of a fighter he is sometimes, just with the fact that you mentioned the layoff, but also, he had that 2-fight losing streak where he lost to Cerrone and then he lost to Charles Oliveira. And I know he's switching camps and everything like that. And now he's back. He's in the featherweight division now, and he's really sort of teared things up. And, props to him for a really, dominant win over Rick Glenn, Rick Glenn himself coming off a big win over Gavin Tucker. So, I mean, the fact that Jury was able to go out there and make some magic. I mean, here's a guy who's, 17-2 now, and we can start talking about him as getting some more marquee fights here, and he's still relatively young for the most part. Let me just look up his age here. He's 29, not quite 30 yet, so he's getting there. But that's not bad for a guy who I think a lot of people are kind of writing off after those 2 losses, and he's done quite well for himself. And he happens to look like James Franco, so maybe they can market him that way.
Mikhail Alexachek looked very good. That's a prospect. 22 years old in a light heavyweight. That is one of those divisions that skews way, way older. So him getting a win over Khalil Roundtree in such one-sided fashion, that's good. You had Marvin Vettori in a pretty fun fight against Omari Akhmedov. You interviewed Vettori, and good God, I guess it's not a surprise that Akhmedov has never been knocked out cold. He's been finished by TKO, but not by KO because he was getting clipped. Those are a couple of fights that stood out to me. Also, Luis Smolka. You think he's done in the UFC?
Has to be. I think Mike Bond had the tweet out tonight. I think has the most losses in a row in flyweight history. I think 4 in a row now. It's unfortunate. I remember this guy headlining, the Ireland card, and defeating Paddy Houlihan, and just what a fall from grace since then. He's also got a win over Ben Wynn too, but 4 in a row. I know, tough competition. I mean, you look at the guys he's fought in that stretch: Brandon Moreno, Ray Borg, Tim Elliott, in Matthias tonight, Nicolau. Yeah, it's tough. So I think he's probably going to get cut after this. It doesn't, sometimes these are good situations for fighters like him. He's 26. He can go to another, people are saying Bellator, but to my knowledge, Bellator doesn't have flyweight fighters, right? So I would imagine he might.
Well, I mean, you know how a lot of these guys do. They'll move over to a Bellator and they'll fight at bantamweight. But if you're going to do that, right, I'm sure Rizin would pay him a good chunk of money to fight McCall or Horiguchi, because they've got a few guys over there worth something. And that there are fights out there for him, because there are always people like somebody's going to look for a fight for Bagatinov somewhere. So, I mean, there are guys, and he has been in like a name in that division. But ever since he made that comment about Sergio Pettis pulling out of that fight, he didn't endear himself to people. He injured his vagina thing. Hasn't won a fight since then. Like, Brandon Moreno made his name off of Smolka, and then Ray Borg got a title shot off of Smolka, and then Tim Elliott rebounded from his championship fight off of Smolka, and now Nicolau beat him, and he's looking good. He's a win or two away from a title shot in that division. So I think Smolka's gone. I think that, and it's a shame, because he turned his life around after having that battle with alcoholism that he talked to you about in that interview. But that's probably the story that stood out to me most. But even though this wasn't the most exciting of shows, there were a few little stories. There's the return of Myles Jury. There's Vettori and Akhmedov had a good fight. A light heavyweight prospect, Smolka, may be gone. Also, Mark De La Rosa, even though he lost, he got in the UFC. He and his wife, Montana, who you've interviewed both of them as well, the first husband and wife to compete in the UFC like at the same time.
Yeah, and people were, I saw a lot of people writing off Mark tonight in that fight. With the performance he had, he fought Tim Elliott, a guy who's a lot more experienced, and a guy who's been around a lot longer. And De La Rosa was trying out for the Ultimate Fighter at featherweight, and then he gets his call. I mean, that's a tough call to get a short notice fight. I think De La Rosa will be back. He's still relatively young. He's a guy that we should be keeping an eye on in the division. But Tim Elliott too had a lot of weight on his shoulders heading into this one, of course, with his coach Robert Follis passing, and him getting this win, I'm sure, is a big weight off his shoulders as well too. So kind of good to see Elliott get the win, but for De La Rosa, I think there's a bright future for him in the sport, and tonight will be a good learning experience for him, just his first loss too. So that's kind of interesting as well.
A couple of notes from the press conference. Khabib does not want corners throwing in a towel for fighters, says that he would not want his corner to do that. Well, that's not smart.
Yeah.
Khabib assesses Conor's chances. He says he has a chance with his boxing, maybe for a couple of minutes. He has to come back and defend his belt. And he said that he did try to finish Barboza but couldn't do it. says that if you want your dreams to come true, you have to take it, and says Mike Tyson fighting or watching him fight was one of those. Also, you watched him fight, James. How were you able to be in the crowd there pretending to be Dean Ambrose and make it back in time for this podcast?
I can't tell you my secret, because then if everyone knows, then they'll start doing it. But let's just say I'm very efficient.
We got plenty of those comments. Yes, Dean Ambrose was in the crowd with Renee Young, so that's a thing.
Are they together? I'm so out of the loop with the wrestling.
Yeah.
Oh wow. Okay.
Yeah,
that's interesting.
Perhaps one of the reasons why Renee sticks in WWE. I can't say that for certain. I've never talked to her about it, but I know that there's a lot of interest in her from our like news stations and sports stations around the country, because she's one of the best of all time already at her job in WWE. So
yeah, I knew her when she used to work at the same company I did at the Score way back in the day. So it's she's also from Toronto. So it's it's interesting. Wow, that's full circle right there. Because yes, I get told I look like Dean Ambrose, and yes, I agree with that. That or Ryan Bader, I'll take it. It's all good with me.
That's true. Khabib says that the weight cut wasn't an issue. Says it's more about how hard he trains and getting injured. When he's healthy, he always makes weight. He says hopes to stay busy next year. Wants to fight April or May, then in September, then in December. So that's Khabib not shying away from anything. Says that he'd like to fight in Russia, but they have to work hard in Russia. I promote UFC in Russia. They don't promote. And says that the UFC needs to work with him to promote in Russia.
Well, the interesting thing about Russia that I've heard anyways from my good friend Karim Zidane is that he doesn't think that Khabib will want to fight in Russia, even though he's immensely popular over there. I think it's a money thing. I think he'll actually make more money in the States. That was sort of one of the issues. So if it does happen, that'd be great. But it just sounds like there's too much red tape. And like I said, Khabib might say that it's sort of in the public face of saying that he, wants to fight there. But I think, money-wise, it's better for him to fight in the States. And, be more of a marquee fight if he fights in like a Vegas as opposed to somewhere in Russia.
Hey guys, if this is your first time checking out this show, head over to Fightful.com. We have all your MMA, boxing, pro wrestling news. If you don't like one of the three, you can always filter them out. James has a bunch of exclusives for you. I always do. David Bixenspan, Brandon Howard, Chris Harrington, Carlos Toro. We have an awesome team. I counted it up, over 200 interviews since we launched in the middle of last year. Like, that is insane across MMA, pro wrestling, and boxing. We've broken a bunch of stories. But one I'm wondering, is there like a new Will Smith movie called Bright on Netflix? Because if so, I didn't hear anything about it tonight at all on the broadcast.
Oh my God, that was too much. That it's one thing for this this card to maybe not play out the way people wanted it as far as some of the matchups, but that just made it that much worse. That was too much.
Like, we have an option on our site where advertisers, like, they can skin our site and have their product up there. This was that, plus like a pop-up ad, plus like an autoplay ad, plus like an insert in the middle. That was nuts. By the way, guys, we also have a Tuesday podcast. It's the Holy Smokes MMA podcast. Showdown Joe will be back with me on Tuesday, 3 p.m. Eastern. We're dropping a lot of great stuff on the wrestling side, on the MMA side, even though there's a little bit of a break. James has a ton of content that'll be going up soon. He talked to Stipe Miocic. He talked to Stephen Wonderboy Thompson. Those will be coming up soon. Curtis Blades, like all kinds of people. Also, James, you have that MMA industry podcast that drops every week where you talk to people involved in the business. Let people know a little bit about that.
Yeah, I love this project. It's been a lot of fun. It's like Sean said, the industry podcast where we talk to people about everything that goes on in the industry, from journalists to managers. Last week I had on Ed Cap, who's one of the top PR guys in MMA as far as, managing fighters and booking interviews and things like that. So really trying to get a different perspective out there. There's so many MMA podcasts out there that are kind of waters down the market, except for Holy Smokes, of course, which is a very unique take on things. But, in general, it's just there's a lot of podcasts out there. So I wanted to cover something that isn't covered too much, and that is the behind the scenes of the industry. And I love doing it. And we're live every Thursday, usually around 1 o'clock Eastern. Sometimes the times change, but we're always I'm always trying to get different guests on and give you guys some inside look into what goes on in this industry.
I was on the first episode, and it's funny because when James and I did one of our first podcasts together, I was like, man, I have this idea for this like wrestling podcast, and it was the same idea that you had for the MMA side. So of course I was happy to give the thumbs up on that as well. You all have to check that out. There are a lot of you who wonder how the inner workings of a lot of this goes on. And James and I both do this full time, and it's a really good insight, whether you're interested in getting involved in it or not. Just the process that fighters go through, the process that managers, that writers, that journalists go through, that just a lot of different things, agents. It's such a great, interesting take on things, and that is up on our iTunes, Stitcher, Player FM, our YouTube, all that good stuff. We got it. James, tell the people where they can follow you on social media before we go.
Easiest way, Twitter, at Lynch on Sports. You can find all of my work there, and of course, everything on Fightful.com. Sean mentioned it there. We got Colby Covington last week. I got talked to Stephen Wonderboy Thompson today. I talked to Stipe Miocic on Friday. Got a couple interviews lined up next week. We're going to drop those as soon as possible. And just what a way to cap off 2017. It's been a great year. Been very happy to be part of Fightful. And Sean, you don't know this, but it's actually my birthday today, so that's why I'm wearing the Street Fighter.
Holy crap!
So there we go. I had to come in style. So there we go.
What's the age?
33.
33.
Yeah.
Hot dog. Happy birthday to James Lynch.
Wouldn't be anywhere else right now than talking fights with you on my birthday.
It's a celebration.
Yeah.
My God. Happy birthday to James Lynch. Megan Anderson just called out Cris Cyborg on Twitter. Follow me at Sean Ross Sapp. Follow us at Fightful Online. We got an Instagram. We're always updating it every day, especially for you wrestling fans. I am having one of my exclusive photos posted that I've taken. I've done a lot of photography too. Like when you're in this line of work, you got to be able to do a little bit of everything. So those are getting up there, like stuff that you may have seen all over the web, but you might not have known it came from me. Hot diggity darn. James Lynch's birthday. Everybody wish him a happy birthday. Leave us a thumbs up, subscribe, all that good stuff. Until next time, guys, we are out.